"You're not going anywhere. Not in this." The rain had been falling since late afternoon, the kind that doesn't bother announcing itself. No thunder, no warning, just a gray curtain dropping over Toronto like someone had finally given up, trying to keep the city dry. By 9 o'clock, the streets of the financial district were nearly empty. Most people had the sense to be somewhere else. Callum Warwick did not go home at a reasonable hour. He hadn't in years. He had stayed in the office until the cleaning crew on the 32nd floor started giving him sympathetic looks, which was how he knew it was past 8. Callum Warwick, Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Capital Group, holder of 2 engineering degrees, and a reputation for making decisions that other men spent months avoiding. Undone by a cleaning crew's pity, he'd finally packed up his laptop, taken the elevator down alone, and stepped out onto Bay Street into the rain. He didn't have an umbrella. He never had an umbrella. It was one of those things his assistant kept gently suggesting, and he kept ignoring because somewhere in the architecture of his daily life, being caught in the rain felt like the one thing he hadn't scheduled, and therefore the one thing that still belonged to him. His car was parked in the underground lot 2 blocks east. He walked with his collar turned up and his hands in his coat pockets, thinking about a number, a projection figure that had been sitting wrong in his chest all afternoon, like a stone he couldn't swallow. He wasn't worried exactly. He was never worried exactly. He just paid very close attention, and sometimes that felt the same. He was nearly at the corner of King and Yonge when he saw her. She was standing at the bus shelter, except she wasn't really standing. She was leaning against the side panel with one shoulder, arms crossed tight, head bowed slightly. Her scrubs were soaked through. The shelter had a roof, but the wind had made it irrelevant, driving the rain in sideways until the bench inside was slick and useless. She had a bag on the ground beside her that had started to collapse in on itself from the wet. Her phone was in her hand, but the screen was dark. Callum slowed. He had passed 100 people in shelters before. 1,000. Toronto at night in the rain was full of people waiting for something that hadn't come yet. He had never stopped, not because he was indifferent, but because he was moving with direction, always moving with direction, and stopping required a reason he could name. He couldn't name this one. He just stopped. "The 504 isn't running," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were dark and very tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from one bad night, but from many bad nights stacked on top of each other until they've started to look like a personality. They rerouted everything west of Bathurst an hour ago. "There's flooding near the underpass." She looked at him for a moment without speaking. "I know," she said finally. Her voice was steady despite the cold. "I'm waiting to see if they reroute back. They won't. Not tonight." She looked back down at her phone, the dark screen, and said nothing. Callum stood there in the rain, which was not something he did. He tried to think of what a reasonable person would do. He thought about the projection figure. He thought about his car, 2 blocks away, heated seats, the quiet. He thought about the way she had looked at her phone like she already knew the answer, but hadn't been ready to accept it yet. "I have a car nearby," he said. "I can take you where you need to go." She looked up again. This time she studied him more carefully, the way someone does when they are deciding whether to trust a stranger. Not naively, not quickly, but with a kind of weary pragmatism. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "My name is Callum Warwick. I work at Meridian Capital, the building on the corner. I'm not going to do anything except drive you home." He paused. "You're soaking wet and it's 9 degrees. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she picked up her bag from the ground. "Nora Tessier," she said, "and I'm sitting in the back seat." "That's fine," he said. He gave her his coat before they'd gone half a block. She resisted for exactly 4 seconds and then put it on without another word, pulling it around her shoulders in the way people do when they've stopped performing and just need to be warm. In the car, she sat behind him and gave him an address in Parkdale. He didn't comment on the distance. He put the heat on without asking. They didn't talk much. The wipers moved back and forth and the city slid past wet and amber, and she sat very still in the back seat, her bag in her lap, her eyes on the window. At one point he asked if she was warming up. She said yes a little, that was all. When he pulled up to her building, a narrow low-rise on a residential street with a buzzer panel that looked like it predated him by 20 years. She got out and then paused with the door open. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it. You would have figured it out," he said, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." She nodded once, handed his coat back through the door, and went inside. Callum sat there for a moment in the idling car, rain on the roof, the coat folded on the back seat. Then he pulled away and drove home and tried to figure out why that had felt like something. He found out 3 weeks later that Nora Tessier was a registered nurse at St. Joseph's Health Center, that she worked rotating shifts, days and nights alternating on a schedule that seemed designed to prevent the human body from ever adjusting, and that she had been doing this for 6 years. He found out because he saw her again. It wasn't planned. He had gone to St. Joseph's with Gordon Fisk, his head of community investment, to visit a youth literacy program they'd been quietly funding for 2 years. The hospital had agreed to host the program's overflow sessions in one of their community rooms on the 3rd floor, an arrangement that Callum had approved in about 90 seconds 8 months ago, and then never thought about again. He was standing in the hallway outside the community room, half listening to Gordon explain the retention metrics, when she came around the corner pushing a medication cart. She looked up and recognized him at the same moment he recognized her. Both of them paused in the specific way of people whose internal worlds had just been interrupted. "Mr. Warwick," she said. "Miss Tessier," he said, and then felt faintly absurd for having remembered her name, and for the speed with which it had surfaced. Gordon looked between them with the professional discretion of a man who understood when to go find something else to do. He found something else to do. "You work here," Callum said. 6 years. She had her hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her head like she'd forgotten about them. "You fund the reading program." "We do." She tilted her head slightly. "I didn't know that. We don't generally advertise it." She looked at him with that same weighing expression she'd had at the bus shelter, like she was trying to find the angle and finding only the flat plane of the fact. "Why not?" He thought about it. "Because the program isn't about us." Something in her expression shifted, barely perceptibly. She looked back down at her cart. "I should get back, of course." She was 2 steps down the hall when she stopped and half-turned. "I never asked what you were doing out at 9 on a rainy Tuesday," she said. "Working late. You do that a lot?" "Most nights." She nodded slowly, like this confirmed something. Then she went back to her cart and her round and her patience, and he watched her go for exactly as long as was acceptable, and then looked away. Gordon reappeared at his elbow. "Ready?" "Yes," Callum said, and meant it less than usual. Coffee happens 6 days later, in the way that things happen when 2 people are pretending they aren't thinking about them. He had sent a note, not an email, a proper handwritten note to the nursing station at St. Joseph's addressed to Nora Tessier that said only, "Coffee if you'd like. No obligation. See Warwick with his cell number below." She texted the number 3 days after that. "Are you always this formal?" He typed back, "Are you always this direct?" She replied, "I work 12-hour shifts. I don't have time for anything else." They met at a small place on Roncesvalles that she chose, a coffee shop with mismatched chairs and the smell of cardamom in the walls. She was already there when he arrived, hands wrapped around a mug, and she did not stand up or make any ceremony of his arrival, which he found he appreciated more than he expected. They talked for 2 hours. Not about his company or her career in any impressive sense. About the things underneath. She told him about growing up in Sudbury, her grandmother's kitchen, the particular loneliness of doing a job that everyone called meaningful, but that came with $11 parking and a broken staff locker room. He told her about sleeping 4 hours a night, about the strange unreality of having everything quantifiable go well, while feeling like he was standing on the outside of his own life watching it happen to someone else. So, she didn't flinch when he said it. She just nodded. "I know that feeling," she said. "Mine looks different. Same feeling." He walked her to the streetcar stop afterward. They shook hands at the corner, which afterward he found both very funny and very sad. The thing about Nora Tessier was that she didn't soften herself for comfort. He learned this slowly, over the weeks that followed, over hospital cafeteria soup and walks along the lake, and a Friday evening sitting on the steps of an art gallery, because they'd both arrived 20 minutes before it opened and neither of them had wanted to go back to being somewhere else. She was direct in a way that was not unkind, but was also not cushioned. She said what she thought. She asked what she wanted to know. She had very little patience for performance. He had built a life almost entirely out of performance. Not dishonestly, he believed in what he did, believed in Meridian, believed in the work. But there was a version of himself he'd been presenting so long to boardrooms and investors and journalists, that he had begun to forget it was a version. It was efficient and controlled and largely unreachable, and nobody had ever tried to reach past it because reaching past the CEO of a mid-eight-figure company was not something that occurred to people. Nora didn't treat him like a CEO. She treated him like a person who happened to run a company, which sounds like the same thing and is not. "You do that thing," she said one evening, over takeout containers spread across her small kitchen table. "What thing?" "When something lands wrong, you go very still, like you're deciding whether to feel it or file it." He looked at her. "That's very specific. I've been watching people's bodies for 6 years," she said, not unkindly. "It's an occupational habit." He was quiet for a moment. "My father was very decisive," he said finally. "Very fast. He thought hesitation was the same as weakness. I think I learned to make the stillness look like control." Nora set down her fork. "Is it?" "Sometimes," he said. "Not always." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "My mom used to say the strongest thing you can do is feel something slowly." She paused. She was a palliative nurse. She had a lot of time to think about what things cost people. They sat in the warmth of that for a while. That was when he knew. Not in a sudden rush. He didn't do sudden rushes, but in the quiet accumulation of small certainties that had been building since a rainy corner on Bay Street. He knew the way you know something you've been circling for a long time and finally allow yourself to look at directly. He didn't say it. What he did instead was the thing he knew how to do. He was discreet and methodical, and he told himself it was because he respected her independence, which was true, and because he didn't want to overstep, which was also true, and because he didn't know what to do with what he felt. And moving it into action was the only language he had ever reliably spoken. He found out through a conversation that happened accidentally on purpose with Gordon that St. Joseph's Community Outreach Wing had been quietly running a deficit for 2 fiscal quarters. Their mobile health unit, a retrofitted van that did free clinics in Parkdale and Regent Park, needed a mechanical overhaul that the hospital couldn't fund without cutting something else. Callum directed a 7-figure donation through Meridian's foundation arm before the end of the week. He made sure the paperwork didn't trace back to him in any obvious way. He learned that Nora had completed a graduate nursing certificate 3 years earlier and was partway through a second one, deferring the remaining coursework because of the cost. He set up an anonymous bursary through the nursing faculty at Ryerson, small enough not to draw attention, specific enough to cover exactly the amount she had deferred. He didn't tell her. He told himself this was because it wasn't about her gratitude. He told himself it was because she would object, because she was someone who had built her entire sense of self on not needing anyone to carry things for her, and dismantling that wasn't something he had the right to do. He told himself all of this, and it was all true, and underneath it was also the simpler and harder truth, that he didn't know how to give something to someone directly, that he had been taught early and comprehensively that what you felt was only as real as what you protected people from knowing. Some nights, after they'd said goodnight at a street corner or on a phone call that had gone longer than either of them had planned, he would go back to his apartment and stand in the dark kitchen with the lights of the city below him and think about his father. Patrick Warwick had been a contractor. Not a wealthy one, not at first. He had built the business himself over 30 years, Warwick Construction, which by the time Callum left for university had 47 employees and a solid reputation in southern Ontario. He was a man who had turned capability into character, who believed that what you built was what you were, that the measure of a person was the things they could make stand up against the weather. He died the year Callum turned 31, a fast cardiac event which felt wrong somehow. His father had not been a man who did things fast except that one. Callum had been in Hong Kong for a meeting that could have waited. He had made it back for the last 12 hours, which was enough to sit beside the hospital bed, but not enough to say what he should have said while there was still time and occasion for it. He thought about that a lot. He thought about it when he was with Nora, specifically when she said something that landed in the exact place where words went to be true. He thought about his father and the things that had not been said and the specific and permanent cost of silence applied at the wrong moment, and he thought, I know this. I know what this costs. And still he didn't say it. He had built a language of action because action felt like love made solid and nameable. What he hadn't learned was that sometimes the person in front of you needs the word, not the work. He'd found out she had collapsed on a Tuesday. Gordon called, which surprised him. He hadn't known Gordon knew Nora, except that Gordon had apparently been at a funding meeting at St. Josephs and someone on staff had mentioned in passing that the nurse who'd been the liaison on the mobile unit grant had been taken off the floor. Callum was in a meeting with 4 people from a pension fund when Gordon called. He let it go to voicemail. Gordon called again. Callum looked at his phone, said "excuse me" to the pension fund, and stepped into the hallway. He was at St. Joseph's in 22 minutes. They told him she had been dehydrated, hypoglycemic, and working her 3rd consecutive shift without adequate sleep. She was stable, they said. She was resting. He was not family, they said. "I understand," he said, and sat down in the waiting room with his coat still on. The waiting room had the specific atmosphere of rooms where time has been asked to behave differently, slower, more accountable. He had been in rooms like this before, at 31, and he had not done well in them, and he was not doing especially well now. He sat and kept his hands loose on his knees and did the thing he did. The thing Nora had named. He went very still and tried to decide whether to feel it or file it. He felt it. An hour and a half later, a nurse he didn't recognize told him Miss Tessier was awake and asking who was in the waiting room. He said his name. The nurse came back and said he could go in. She looked pale and smaller than usual against the white of the hospital bed, her hair loose for once, glasses off. There was an IV in her arm. She watched him come in with an expression he couldn't fully read. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know. How did you even know?" He sat in the chair beside the bed. Gordon called. She was quiet. "I hate this," she said. "I hate being the one in the bed. I know that too." She turned her face toward the ceiling. "I've been doing too much. I know I have. I don't know how to stop doing too much. I've been doing too much since I was 19. She paused. "My mom was sick for 2 years before she died. I paid for part of her care. I still have some of that debt. And I keep thinking if I can just keep moving fast enough, I'll get to the other side of it." He was quiet. She turned to look at him. "I didn't tell you any of that," she said. "No, I don't usually tell people that. I know." She let out a long breath. "You're very calm right now. It's slightly unnerving." "I'm not calm," he said. "I'm doing the thing you named." She looked at him. "Filing it," he said. "Because if I stop filing it, I don't know what I'm going to do with the fact that you collapsed in a hospital hallway, and I was in a meeting about infrastructure funds." Her eyes softened. Something in her face shifted. Not breaking, but opening. "Callum," she said quietly, "you've been carrying things alone your whole life," he said. "And you're very good at it. You're probably the best at it of anyone I've ever met. But I would like—" He stopped. He tried again. "I would like you to let me help. Not because you need it, because I want to give it. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long time. The IV dripped. The hall outside moved with its usual busy quiet. "I'm not very good at being helped," she said. "I'm not very good at offering," he said, "so we're even." The corner of her mouth moved, something that might become a smile if given time. He reached over and took her hand. She came home to his apartment. Not that night. She went back to her own place first, which was right, which was how she needed it to go. But over the next 2 weeks she was there more than she wasn't, and then she was there in the particular way of someone who has stopped needing to explain their presence. Her cardigan was on the back of a kitchen chair. Her running shoes were by the front door. Her specific brand of tea that tasted, he had once told her, like someone had dried a forest, was in the cabinet beside his coffee. She had a set of keys. He had not said "I love you." She had not said it either. They moved around the apartment and around each other with the careful deliberateness of 2 people who had both been burned by careless words, who had both learned that sincerity requires more than the right feeling. It requires the courage to make it visible. He was still learning that courage. He showed it in the only ways he knew. He made her breakfast on her early mornings, nothing impressive, eggs and toast, but reliably there. He learned her schedule and reorganized his accordingly without announcing it. He put a blanket on the couch because she was always colder than the apartment required. He started leaving his phone on the kitchen counter instead of his bedside table, which sounds like nothing and meant that he was reachable, that he had decided at some level below conscious decision that being available to her mattered more than the control of being unreachable. But there was still a distance. She felt it. He knew she felt it. And he couldn't close it because closing it required saying a thing that kept sitting in his chest without finding the door out. One evening she found him standing in the study, which was the room he used when he needed to be alone, standing in front of the shelf where he kept the photograph. It was the only one in the apartment, a picture of his father in a hard hat at a build site, grinning at the camera, a man completely comfortable in the space his own capability had made. Nora came and stood beside him without touching him. "You look like him," she said. "I know. Do you talk to him? The photo?" He was quiet. "Sometimes. What do you say?" He looked at the photograph for a long time. The rain was on the windows again, the same flat gray Toronto rain, and the city was below them, and between them and outside them, in the way cities get when you've decided they're home. "I tell him about things I should have told him when I could," Callum said, "and I ask him if he thinks I'm doing it right, the living like a person part." Nora was quiet beside him. "Then, what do you think he says?" "I think he says stop waiting for permission." She turned and looked at him. "Callum," she said, and her voice was very level, very clear, the way her voice got when she was about to say a true thing. "I'm in love with you. I think you know that. I know you do. I can see it. I've seen it for months. But I also need you to know that I can't keep standing in the doorway of someone's life. I've done that before. I can't do it again." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to perform it," she said. "I'm just asking you to let me in. All the way in. Or tell me honestly that you can't." He stood with her words for a moment. He felt the old reflex rise, the stillness, the filing, and he let it come and he let it pass. Then he said, "I love you. I've loved you since a rainy Tuesday that I thought was going to be like every other rainy Tuesday, and you were standing at a bus shelter with a dead phone, and you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth the risk." He paused. "I'm not very good at this, at saying it. I've been showing it in the only language I had, but I think I've been writing you letters in a language you couldn't fully read, and that's not fair to you." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You're allowed to be learning." He crossed the distance between them, all of it, in 2 steps. He took her face in his hands the way you touch something you'd been afraid to break. She let him. She didn't pack her things. They were already there. That was the thing he thought about later. How the move had already happened in the way that real things happen. Not in a single decided moment, but in accumulation. In the gradual weight of presence becoming permanent. Her coffee mug had its spot. Her coat was beside his on the hook by the door. Her name was in his phone under N. No explanation needed. The contact photo taken on a Sunday afternoon walk on the waterfront trail when she hadn't noticed him looking. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday in early May, not with any grand production. He was not a grand production person, and she would have found it excruciating. But quietly, in the kitchen, while she was reading, when the light was coming in right and he looked at her and thought, "This is the version of my life where I stopped waiting for permission." She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. They married in September. Small, meaningful. Colleagues of hers, a few of his people who had earned the designation of friends rather than associates, her aunt from Sudbury who cried from the opening note of the first song and did not stop, an elderly patient who had once sat in the mobile health clinic waiting room and talked to Nora for 40 minutes about his late wife. He came because Nora had tracked him down and asked, because she believed that the people who had shaped a moment deserved to see where it led. Gordon gave a toast that was 8 minutes long and exactly right. Callum's was shorter. "I spent a long time," he said, "being very competent at everything that could be quantified. I am still working on the rest." He looked at Nora. "She is teaching me. I intend to be a very committed student." Nora touched his hand under the table. Afterward, at the end of the evening, when the venue was emptying and they were sitting together in the quiet left behind by people who love you and have finally gone home, she leaned her head against his shoulder. "A rainy Tuesday," she said. "A rainy Tuesday," he said. She laced her fingers through his outside through the tall windows of the reception hall. Toronto gleamed wet and amber in the dark. "I wasn't going to get in the car," she said. "I almost didn't." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I almost didn't stop." She was quiet for a moment. "What made you?" He thought about it the way he thought about things. Carefully, honestly, taking time to find the answer that was actually true rather than the one that sounded good. "You were looking at your phone," he said. "Like you already knew the news was bad, but you hadn't given up yet. And I thought," he paused, "I thought, that is someone who deserves for something to go right tonight." She lifted her head and looked at him. "It did," she said. He looked back at her, this woman who had walked into his careful life and named the things he was doing and waited, with more patience than he deserved for him to find the words to match. He thought of his father in the photograph. He thought, "I think I'm doing it right now." The living like a person part. "Yeah," Callum said. "It did."